Welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your It's Locked host, Madelyn.
I'm your I need a key for that host, Emma. That's not really very good thematically, but whatever.
And thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. This week it's Emma's side quest. So, I can't even guess what it's going to be about. What will it be?
Well, unfortunately, you're just gonna have to figure it out because that's the theme.
Here, I'm going to search my inventory. Look, my notes in front of me say it's about mystery games.
Darn it, she's figured me out. I would have gotten away with it too. If it weren't for the notes in your inventory.
This is a more complex game, maybe.
Really a gap in the market for a good Scooby-Doo game.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are Scooby-Doo games, but I think there should be a better one.
A frightening, photorealistic Scooby.
Maybe not that. Maybe not that.
A live action. Or filmed. All these ones that have the real life film in them. Scooby-Doo.
One of the Scooby-Doo live actions was good. Or I liked it as a child.
Probably a Scooby-Doo game would be they're solving Scrappy's murder or something horrible.
Do oh man, I didn't even put the Sonic game in my notes. Who murdered Sonic the Hedgehog?
See, we could just do that with Scooby-Doo.
Exactly.
So Emma, what made you pick mystery games? Did anything inspire this week's choice?
Well, I guess I'll talk about this in another 2 weeks or so on our 6-week episode, but I just finished playing Master Detective Archives Rain Code, which is Kodaka and the Danganronpa team's new game since finishing Danganronpa. So sort of in that style, but with different sort of mechanics and different characters in a different universe. And so I'd just been thinking about mystery solving because I found Rain Code to be a really interesting example of it's not a very good mystery game, I don't think, in terms of each mystery that it sets up is very easily solvable before you even go into the labyrinth area where you actually solve the mystery. For chapters 1 through 3, I went into them I already know how all of this happened. And that got me thinking about the difficulties of designing a playable mystery, right? Of what is the right balance between, giving players the tools to figure out something for themselves versus keeping them in, withholding information to keep them in suspense for a certain period of time. And how does, how can that be balanced in different types of mystery games? And how does that differ from just, reading a piece of detective fiction or something like that?
So it might be good to start off, and I had never really thought about this before, but I think that you made a great point in our prep work for this episode about not all games that have mysteries in them are, quote, mystery games, end quote.
Yeah. Because it is sort of this is in other media too, but the idea of a mystery just being something that a character or the reader, player, whatever, doesn't know is something that is just a basic building block of plot, right? Is that you discover more information over time?
One would hope.
Yes, to resolve why a conflict is happening or learn why someone is the way there is. So mystery is just sort of one of those basic building blocks that make up a story. But you wouldn't necessarily say all stories are mysteries and have someone understand what you mean by that. Just talking to a friend, right? And so in games too, in games and other media, there's a lot of times, even when a mystery might be more central, but it's not necessarily a mystery video game. And I think in games particularly, I want to talk about ones where there are specifically mechanics. The player is invited to solve a mystery within the game, as opposed to having it play out. I think that the Judgment series from Ryuga Gotoku is a really good example of what I would not consider a mystery game. Like, theoretically in those, you are playing as a detective. The first game has a few little sequences where, like, you have to present evidence at certain times. The second game, like, pretty much entirely drops that, you know?
Which I think is good. Yeah, Original Judgment, I haven't played the second one, but that seems like a positive development to me. Original Judgment definitely has some light, more traditional mystery game elements, but like a little bit of evidence finding, a little bit of testimony stuff.
Yeah.
But that
and there are some, like, theoretically interesting mechanics that you could take from Judgment and put in a mystery game. Like, tailing a suspect is something that doesn't really come up in a lot of mystery games.
That's true.
You do in Judgment, but that doesn't really... Like, you tail a suspect because the game, like, that's
forces
part of
you
the
to.
story, right? And you aren't, like, noticing things as they go. You follow them to the destination and get the answer that you're looking for. So it's not really inviting the player to solve things alongside Yagami. They're just watching Yagami solve things.
Well, yeah, and I think that really gets down to it, is that there's almost no point in that game. And each one of these things that we're saying individually would not disqualify something from being a mystery game, I think is important to say. But all of these little mystery elements are, like, very easy to brute force your way through, and most of the plot and most of the mystery at the heart of that game unravels itself without you playing detective.
Yeah.
And frankly is not that hard to get ahead of pretty early on in the game. So it was interesting for me to have you bring that up, because I think you're absolutely right. It's like, it's about a detective. It turns up in some of these mystery games articles, but is really a game that is about a mystery rather than being a mystery game.
I also think there is more overlap, but a slight difference between, like, mystery games that are mystery games and mystery games that are puzzle games.
Yes.
Right? I think, actually, like, Zero Escape, the series, is a really good example here. Like, yes, there's a central mystery, right? You're in a strange location with these people, and the characters are trying to figure out what's going on, but the player's actual interaction with it is, like, escape rooms, which I wouldn't really... Those are puzzles, right? Those aren't, like, mysteries. I get, like, puzzles are a form of mysteries, I guess, because you're solving something, but, like, I still think of those two as, like, distinct entities, I think.
Yeah, I think, and I say this because I'm more familiar with this game than Zero Escape, so I could be just saying the exact same thing. But, like, Murder by Numbers, I think, is also a great example of this. Murder by Numbers, you are solving cases throughout, but most of the way that you're gathering evidence is some, like, interviewing people, but is mostly solving Picross puzzles that you've point and clicked on, or, you know, switched on, buttoned on, and then finding the evidence because you solved the Picross puzzle. And so while that is, like, more of a mystery game because that Picross is embedded in some simple mysteries than just, like, a Picross game, it's still primarily a puzzle game. Because what you're doing to solve the mystery does not really interact with, like, the actual detective work.
Right, yeah. I think it starts getting, like, muddier and more semantic in this area, right? Because, like, I would still, like, Murder by Numbers is still, like, a mystery, right? It's written as a mystery, but it's not a mystery game in that the mystery is not the part that you're really playing, I guess. How I would want to distinguish it.
So, all this to say, when we're talking about mystery games for the purposes of this podcast, we're talking about the mystery being the primary element, and the mechanics of the game being very centered on and connected to solving that mystery. And a lot of these games look like your classic detective story. Some of them don't. Clickbait Boyfriend and I were saying we think Outer Wilds is a mystery game. I don't know how you feel about that.
That's fair. Yeah. I was thinking about, we talked about Heaven's Vault in our fictional language things, and you could theoretically think of any sort of constructed language games where you have to figure out the language as a type of mystery too.
Yeah.
Although again, we start going like, what's a puzzle versus what's a mystery, I guess. Whereas where that fuzzy sort of overlap happens, I think.
So
Outer Wilds is a really good example of like where I would think like the fuzziest overlap there.
Yeah.
Because some of that's puzzles, but some of that's mystery, I think.
So all this to say is that, listener, you can define mystery game how you want. You may want to sweep some games that we would put in more of the puzzle or games with mysteries category into your mystery game. But we're trying to hit the stuff that's like pure down the center a lot of this episode. Like, absolutely, that's a mystery game. And here's why it's good or bad.
Yeah.
So as we said, like a lot of these, we'll talk about games that are not this, but so many mystery games take the form of you are a detective, like a literal detective of some kind, whether you are a police
or some kind of equivalent.
Yeah,
such as a lawyer, I guess.
Yeah, sure. You are somehow detective, legal system, justice system affiliated, and you've got like a case to solve. Which makes sense because, if you look at like most like mystery literature or mystery television show, that's also what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of detective shows out there.
A lot of detective shows.
So many.
Sort of surprising. Like, you think about like Law and Order as such a defining television franchise. It's sort of funny. I guess like Ace Attorney is sort of that, but it's sort of funny there's not like a video game Law and Order equivalent. I guess the audience for Law and Order is not necessarily the like prime video game audience, but
yeah is Nancy Drew the Law and Order equivalent?
I guess it is. I mean, not anymore, but Nancy Drew from like the late 90s to the early 2000s or the like early 2010s maybe is probably the Law and Order equivalent. That's a hilarious thing to say.
Yeah.
But with their like their twice a year releases.
I know Frogwares has a really long running Sherlock Holmes series also. But although in their Sherlock Holmes series is like supernatural stuff happens, so I feel like that's sort of what separates a lot of what you might call like more of a video game Law and Order thing, is there's a lot more explicit supernatural stuff happening in video game mysteries pretty much all the time.
It makes sense. Like, a lot of Law and Order stuff is pretty grisly, right? I feel like game mysteries, to some extent, sidestep some of the bread and butter horrors of, like, Law and Order in favor of ghosts. And I'll take that. I'll take some ghosts. I'll take ghosts over, like, Nancy Drew SVU,
I mean, the Nancy Drew games, they were formative.
They
sometimes pretended like a lot of like the setup was like something supernatural's going on, but in the sort of Scooby-Doo way. I don't think any of the Nancy Drew games were like, yeah, there's ghosts, if I remember correctly.
There are so many of them that I wouldn't be so sure, but
I guess. But usually, I feel like there were a lot that were like, she's come here to investigate ghosts, right?
Yeah.
And like, it's not ghosts. There's one in like a spooky manor, right?
Yeah. There's actually probably several. I think there's probably 4 or 5 that are in a spooky manner.
Jump to death like several times is what I remember doing.
Yes. The real supernatural of the Nancy Drew series is how many times she dies and comes back to life.
Exactly. Yeah.
So if you aren't familiar with the Her interactive Nancy Drew video games,
sorry,
what were you doing? Like throughout the late 90s and 2000s. But they're like very, very, very classic detective video games, right? You're Nancy Drew. You're here to sleuth something. You go around, you gather evidence, you talk to the people and use the testimony that they give to gather evidence. Sometimes you shoot a guy. That's pretty much all you need. And
Yeah.
you, the player, like, are Nancy Drew. Nancy
Yeah.
is voiced, right? She has a voice. We never see Nancy.
It's first person, yeah.
So it's very much, and that's something that I think we see a lot in these games, this sort of like blurring the line between, like, it's you are the detective, like, you are Nancy Drew. Which in these games that were designed specifically to inspire young women. Great.
There you go. I do think that Nancy Drew is sort of unique in that of like making you feel like Nancy, because, you know, I feel like we can get into this a little bit more later, but I do think in my research I like found like two categories of what I would consider a mystery game, of either you're playing through like a story that's more sort of linear, and then on the other side you have things where like it is more of an open-ended like investigation process, right? And I feel like it's over on the open-ended investigation process where you get more like you are the detective, right? Versus Nancy Drew, I would consider more like you're playing through a story. You have to get the correct answer to get to the next page, right? Versus just sort of going around wherever you feel like and figuring things out in atypical orders or whatever.
That's very true. Yes, Nancy Drew is definitely a linear, very linear mystery story with things that you have to discover in a certain order, which has, I think, fallen a little bit out of vogue in kind of the newer entrance into the genre. Which makes sense. That sort of thing has fallen out of vogue in gaming in general, right?
Yeah. I was the one interview I read for Paradise Killer, like, I totally respect their design philosophy, right? But it did sometimes read like, this person played Nancy Drew games as a kid and got very frustrated on a puzzle. Yeah. That's sort of what I felt like. Is like, and they decided like, oh yeah, okay, so we're going to design so that doesn't happen.
This guy played the Nancy Drew game where one of the puzzles is you have to get someone to write something playing Hangman.
Yeah.
And got stuck.
Exactly.
One thing I want to note about Nancy Drew is, so like something we'll see across a lot of these detective games and these mystery games is like the handy dandy notebook, right? Yeah. Blue's Clues style. And that's something I'd love to talk about a little bit more as like, what an interesting little like help that you give people, and like when you need that and when you're coddling the player with that and how it works and how it doesn't. But I thought it was interesting that, so the Nancy Drew games do have like difficulty levels, which is something that, at least to my stupid brain, seems like a hard thing to implement in a mystery game. Because, like, how do you make it harder?
Yeah.
But in Nancy Drew, what that means is that, like, in the junior detective level, she's got her little, like, here's my task list notebook. And in the senior detective level, you've got to be the detective and keep that task list in your brain. Also, some of, like, the Sudoku gets harder. But I thought that was an interesting distinction of, like, the only thing that I can think of in some of these games where you could actually take it away and discern a difficulty level. Because in this sort of, like, game, it's like, it's not like, how could I add extra clues? Like, what would I do without totally changing what's going on?
Yeah. In hard mode, you have to go out to the store and buy your own notebook, essentially.
Type it in.
That's hip now.
Look, I wrote like 5-6 pages of notes on Tunic, so I can't even talk.
That's fair.
They're scary notes too, and I accidentally, no, I didn't. It wasn't that notebook. I like had left a notebook somewhere, and I was like, what if my Tunic notes are in that and someone sees it? That would have looked scary. Anyway, if you're gonna jump into the Nancy Drew games, maybe the older ones, maybe. Unclear if the newer one is any good, but the graphics look awful. I was looking at some of those pictures of like the games. I'm like, wow, they can't have looked like that.
The Hardy Boys were not very handsome, I don't think.
No. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you. I should say they're all on Steam now. There's you can go down a whole Nancy Drew rabbit hole, so I won't even start. But read about the Nancy Drew series. There's all sorts of stuff. Anyway.
Have we done that? We must have done that already.
I'm pretty sure we have, or we've talked about them in some other context before, at least.
Yeah, I was just going to transition and say that I think of all, like, mystery games, probably the biggest one, most mainstream one, is L.A. Noire from Rockstar. Which, honestly, I'm not very familiar with beyond the memes. Press X to doubt, for example. But it was sort of, I guess, sort of revolutionary at the time for its motion capture. So, you know, you play as Cole Phelps throughout the game. You're sort of moving desks over time, and so you handle a bunch of different types of cases. In each case, you know, you gather evidence. You have interrogations with suspects where you give them evidence, and they will have, you know, like facial reactions based on what they say. And so it's your job to sort of pay attention to their facial reactions and respond accordingly to either call them out on what seems like a lie or, you know, let them off if they're clearly telling the truth. Which apparently this does get more subtle as cases progress. Like later in the game is not quite as like obvious, but in early cases when someone's lying, it is very like these people do not have any sort of poker face whatsoever. Which is again like very funny little thing. But it is an interesting idea and something you can really only do I feel like with more photorealistic graphics, is that you can use facial expressions more effectively, because I feel like if you're using anything else, it's a little more obvious. I mean, not that it's not obvious in L.A. Noire sometimes, but
it has to be more obvious.
Yeah.
It's definitely an interesting. It's funny, right? Because it's basically the same thing. This is going to sound stupid at first, but bear with me. It's like the same thing as the Phoenix Wright thing. It's just that instead of it being like I'm combing through the dialogue for like the key clues, and I'm sure you do some of that in L.A. Noire too, but instead of it being like I'm combing through the dialogue to pull out the lie, it's I'm watching the facial expression very closely to pull out the lie. That is probably bad detective work. I'm going to throw that out there. That probably... Sure. That shouldn't be how police operate primarily.
I don't think Cole Phelps is a very good policeman by the end, to be fair, so putting that out there.
Okay, good. As long as we're not role modeling that like you should be solving all cases based on if somebody winces when they say something, that seems good.
Yeah. But you can, I don't actually know, I feel like L.A. Noire does adapt a little bit to let you be wrong in certain cases, but I don't actually know how it works. I feel like you probably have to solve a case before it lets you on to the next one, but I didn't look into its structure that much.
Well, can I use that as a jumping off point to some, like, mystery games broadly thoughts before we zoom back in?
Sure.
So I watched a great video from Game Developers Toolkit on what makes a good detective game that I thought was a really interesting way of thinking about, okay, what do games do well in terms of adapting sort of a classic mystery story, and what do they sometimes have more of like a struggle with? Right, so like for the most part, games do a really good job, or you know, not necessarily really good job, but they do a fairly they can do quite a good job without having to innovate too much on kind of the gathering information phase of a mystery story, right? Because in a game, it's pretty easy to replicate like what would it be like to go to a crime scene, right? I look around. Right? Yeah. I look at things that are interesting. And there are different ways to give the player more or less freedom in doing that. But like, okay, that pretty much captures what that's like, at least what you see detectives do in like a movie. Right? Yeah. And similarly, it's pretty easy to capture the like, I'm talking to a witness thing. Not like interrogating someone, but it's like, I'm talking to a witness, I'm gathering some information. Right? All of that, pretty doable in games. And we see it in games that even aren't mystery games all the time. But when we get to the actual like good detective work part of a mystery story is where like it gets a lot more like challenging and a lot of choices to make about sort of how much you want to hold the player's hand and also how much you want to make them feel like actually smart, like a good detective, right? So you might think of, like you said, the like press A to doubt thing. It's like so many sort of mystery games, and this video talks about The Wolf Among Us, sort of as an example of this, is like you'll be interrogating someone and at some point the game prompts you to be like, what were they lying to you about just now? Kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or what doesn't add up here? And you've got like 4 choices and you pick one.
Yeah.
Right? And that's kind of bad. Like that's kind of a bad way to make the player feel like a good detective. Or to make the player work for the knowledge. Because you've both told them that they should have noticed something and they're probably going to be able to figure out pretty easily through the context of those 4 like options what that is, and even if they're not, there's probably no real consequence for them getting it wrong, so they can just kind of guess until they get it right. And that doesn't make you feel like a detective. That just makes you feel like you're moving through a game.
There is sorry, not to interrupt your kind of train of thought, but I do think, you know, Disco Elysium is one that I would put sort of in the fuzzy center of, is this a mystery game? But it does handle like little checks interestingly of, sometimes you'll have a check that you fail, like just randomly, and Harry will be like, yeah, this seems fine. And you're like looking at the failure, like, uh-oh. Oh no.
That's not good.
So it can be effective to make you feel like a failure of a detective, I guess.
Yeah.
If you want to make you feel like you suck. Or Harry sucks, I guess, more specifically.
It's weird, right?
There.
Like, Disco Elysium might be like, well, I don't know. I haven't played it, so this is just from like hearing you talk about it and reading about it. But it's like, it might be a detective game without being a mystery game.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is weird.
Yeah.
But anyway, like, so the video went through all of these sort of like creative ways of like, okay, like if there's a point where it's like you need to solve something, or you need to catch someone in a lie, or you need to prove something, like how do you give the player enough sort of agency and freedom so that they can actually feel like a detective, not feel like, and I thought this was an interesting way of like sort of thinking about it, like you don't want to feel like the game is just like being like, did you get it? Like, are you keeping up here? Yeah. You want it to feel like, oh, like I have that light bulb moment and I've discovered something, right? So like the more ways, like there are all sorts of games that have like more modular ways that you have to like prove things, where you're selecting evidence and verbs, or even like Ace Attorney like gives you more choices and more ways to screw things up, and you have the health bar for consequences than if it's just like there are only 4. So like one way that gets saved is by being like, okay, at least make it so the player can't just like brute force their way through this, right? But then there are all these games that are like, how do we make it so we're not even really asking the question, right? Because there's that like 2-part portion of like, okay, what are your answers, right? And once you get to the point where your answers are complicated, that's okay. But if you were an actual detective, there wouldn't be any point in the universe where the universe is like, you've probably got enough evidence now.
Yeah.
So it seems like one of the frequent ways that games solve that is by creating like a search bar element, basically. And I'm sure we'll talk about her story a bit later. But like basically avoiding, like we talked about earlier, that like classic like notepad situation of, well, my character has taken notes on things and those notes are going to tell me what's important and what I can actually put together. Or he talked about one game where it was like, they don't even give you locations to go. Like you have to look up, I think this was one of the Sherlock Holmes games, maybe, where it's like, you have like a whole directory of places in London. So it's not like in Nancy Drew where it's like, oh, I can go to the town, or I can go to the house, or I can go to the whatever. It's like you actually have to know what place is significant before you even know you can go there. Which I was like, that's wild. That's something that like I don't even think of as something that could be an option in games like this. It's like, of course there are locations. But of course if I was an actual detective, there wouldn't be dots on a map. So it was
Yeah,
fascinating to
absolutely.
sort of, I hadn't really thought about it too much from this perspective before, to think about the ways in which, you either give or take away agency from the player because, because you want it to be a certain degree of easy or hard,
Yeah.
basically. And that sometimes going too far toward easy, not even just too far towards easy, but too far toward like giving too many prompts or too rigid of an evidence log or something like that, you like cease to feel like you're solving a mystery.
Yeah. So I think that's actually a good transition to dive back in. I mentioned that I feel like there's a distinction between something that's more linear and something that's more open-ended in mystery games. And I thought that there was a rough translation of Shu Takumi gave like a talk at like a game developers conference. Shu Takumi is the original creator of Phoenix Wright, where he was talking about like the things that he thinks goes into good mystery writing and what he wants the player to get out of playing something like Ace Attorney. And I thought it was really interesting of saying that he wants the player to both be the detective that's unveiling the truth and the reader that is surprised by the truth. And so in different parts of a single case or a single story he's doing, there's both the surprise moments, right, of like where you're taken aback or shocked by something that's happening, and also the naruhodo, the I see parts, where you've looked at the clues and you've put something together and you're able to advance the story through your own like figuring it out, right? And I think that a more open-ended detective game actually wants just mostly like it's a little bit of both, but wants more of like the I see ness and not a lot of the surprise, right? Because I think the surprise comes sometimes from like withholding things that are then revealed at certain times, and that recontextualizes things that's happening, and that's more of like something you can do in a linear story, but might be harder when someone is pulling things from wherever within your mystery.
Yeah, I think you can have more like those. I think those surprise moments in more open-ended games like come when you realize you've like messed up.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's less of the like, oh my gosh, new information is revealed like in the specific way, and more in the like, oh my gosh, that guy in Oberdin wasn't who I thought he was, crap.
Yeah.
Like I have to undo like all of this. Like, oh no.
And then you also have stuff like, I feel like Paradise Killer is like the super extreme where like it doesn't really even tell you if you're right. Like there, you create a valid case, but you never really get even like an I see moment because it never validates your answer particularly. So you could even go as far as that of like you'll never really be sure, or to whatever extent that is. I haven't finished Paradise Killer myself, but from the way that it was talked about, it just seems like you put together a case, you present the case, maybe it's right.
And there's like different things that serve different stories, right? That would be super weird in an Ace Attorney game.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There's fun little tricks sometimes. The first great Ace Attorney game does have a fun little thing of like, if you examine certain evidence at different times throughout the trial, it's different, right? So there's one case that plays with that of like, oh, were you examining evidence as you should have been? You stupid lawyer. Mm-hmm. Which is, a little fun element to that. But there's also, there's a little bit of like more linear ones are telling you sort of a story, and more open-ended ones are about you solving the mystery, even if you're playing as a character.
Well, I mean, as you were just saying there, I think that comes back around to that. Are you the detective, or is there a detective that you are playing in the game? Because if you're the detective, it's just more based on your experience and that sort of thing. So it lends itself more to linearity or not based on those perspectives as well.
Yeah. And of course, there's also Danganronpa is sort of unique among mystery games because it combines it with the death game genre, which I thought was it. You know, I read a couple of interviews with Kodaka compared against Shutakumi talking about rating Ace Attorney, and Shutakumi was like, "Oh, I start from the scenario for the case, right? Because it's the mystery. So what is the mystery?" Whereas Kodaka's like, "Well, we make the characters first, right? And then we slot the characters into cases," which I think is more representative of like the death game element. Puts more emphasis on the characters versus like a more episodic mystery by mystery thing where you just have like maybe Phoenix and his couple of assistants that are with you. But that was like an interesting, different sort of writing process of how do you approach writing a mystery game.
It was wild to me that the Ace Attorney, like, they come up with the characters last. Like, that's wild. How do you even do that? How would your brain even work that way?
Well, you probably have, the roles, right? But you don't necessarily have the look or personality of the person filling that role yet.
Fair enough, I guess.
Right? Like, you're thinking about you have the culprit, what is the culprit doing? What are the red herrings, right? But you don't necessarily have, like, and this one has a clown nose. I don't know. Right?
Yeah, that's fair. Overall, it seems like writing a mystery in general seems like one of those things that if you don't think about it is like, oh, how hard could that be? Right? Yeah. Like I've played Clue, but when you actually sort of drill down into like, how do you actually, especially in a, at least semi-interactive format or very interactive format, depending on how open and, involved your mystery game is, how do you like lead the player along the trail of breadcrumbs without them getting stuck, with everything seeming fair? I think that's probably one of the trickiest things of all, is you want to have twists. You want to have those surprise moments if you're building something that's at least semi-linear, but you don't want it to be, and I think it was in the Shu Takumi interviews. No, I can't remember. I can't remember if this is in Danganronpa or Ace Attorney. So one of them talked about how, maybe it was Danganronpa, that like, yeah, it's like, it's easy to have something like, yeah, it was Danganronpa. Something like, oh, surprise, something was happening off screen that you didn't know about. Yeah. Right. But it's a lot harder, but also sort of like more fun, rewarding, interesting if the things that are going to be twist things, like you saw them happening. Yeah.
Yeah. Danganronpa V3 is definitely one of my favorite games, and I think it's because it really rewards a second playthrough, both in terms of each of the individual cases and in terms of like the overarching mystery of you play through it again and you're like, oh my god, like I see it now.
Yeah,
see it. I see the vision. And I think that is definitely very important for mystery writing. And it is very challenging on like an individual level. Like when Ace Attorney or Danganronpa or anything like it is working, like, oh man, the endorphins in your brain going off, going crazy, saying, wow, I'm so smart. And then occasionally you get stuck on something like he flew, or the world is round, or what an octagon is. And you're like, what are we doing? What are we talking about? So it is hard to balance. There was an interview with The Case of the Golden Idol, which is a recent game that came out that has a bunch of like little mysteries that people were really into when it came out, and they just talked about like testing it, right? Of like when you're writing it and you already know the answer to a mystery, it's very hard to test it and be like, are we giving the player enough information or too much information? Because you already know. And so you might be making connections in your head that an average player wouldn't, because they're theoretically going in with no foreknowledge.
Yeah.
And so you have to just do testing to figure out like, okay, like, are people getting frustrated? Are people picking this up too easily? Like, what do we do here? Because you can't do it yourself. You can test that things aren't buggy yourself, but you can't really test, like, can you figure this out at the correct rate?
And I think the balance is even harder with mystery games than with some other genres because, like, of course, in any given game, you want some degree of, like, friction or player frustration, right? Like, if the game is too easy, it's not fun. But I feel like that's even more core to mystery games, right? Like, you don't want to feel like the mystery is too easy to figure out, or even worse, that you're, like, 4 steps ahead of where the detective in the game is. Right.
Yeah. It feels almost like constantly designing, like it's an entire game of designing tutorials.
Yeah.
Sort of. Like, how much are we effectively teaching the player? Are we holding the player's hand way too much? Are we not letting them figure things out for themselves? You know, how much should we tell them? How much should we hold back? And that sounds awful.
It's also funny because, of course, in real life, I'd love to be 4 steps ahead of everyone around me.
Oh, sure, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, that's a scenario where it's like, oh, like, I know how things are going to go 4 steps ahead. Like, man, I wish. I can't remember the last time I felt like I knew how things were going to go 4 steps ahead in anything I work on.
Theoretically, that wouldn't be a problem if the game could possibly allow for that, right? Which I think just in most cases, even in open-ended cases, like, you still have to collect that evidence even if you know it in your brain, right?
Yeah.
You can't just be like you can't be in, like, Tears of the Kingdom, like, have done everything and then tell everybody, like, 10 weeks later, like, oh yeah, I found the Master Sword already. What? Why didn't you say anything?
Come on, dude.
The one exception to this, I think, is I forgot about this until, like, we started talking, but this game called Shadows of Doubt came out recently, which is a sandbox procedurally generated murder mystery game.
Oh, weird.
Yeah, so you're in the city, murders happen, you pick up a case, the whole thing is sort of like, every case is different, right? It assembles evidence, it assembles who the culprit is, and then you sort of have to just figure out where to go and what to do from your investigation. And if you, happen to go to a crime scene really fast and see the culprit, like, coming out, you can just grab him, right? You don't have to do all this crime-solving business. You just be like, hey, this guy.
Citizen's arrest.
It's turning him in.
I'm not sure I want that. I mean, maybe it's good, right? If it's good, awesome. But mystery does to me feel like a genre that needs crafting. If it's gonna, like, I'm sure that sort of thing is like, oh, it's good, and obviously the replay value, and there's probably something different to that. But I think it would be hard for something like that to hit, like, the true heights of a really well crafted, intentionally crafted thing.
Yeah, it is. The Paradise Killer interview was really interesting. Because I don't remember who it was, but the designer on it was saying, like, I approach this, from a designer's point of view. I from systems, not from, like, narratives or anything. So, it's more about how the player can interact with the systems to solve, a case. And, like, this one does have, like, pre-established characters and stuff versus the procedural one, the Shadows of Doubt, which, there's still characters and stuff, right? The things in it are crafted, right? And then is taking those crafted things and, like, randomizing them.
Sure.
That's simplifying it, but that's essentially what it's doing. So, it wouldn't necessarily be like, oh, someone's written, like, a really good mystery story, but about the enjoying the act of piecing together the mystery more. It doesn't necessarily matter who the characters were. You just like the, like, collection of information, parsing that information, like putting together a case, figuring stuff out. That process, if that process is what is satisfying to the player, then I think that something like a procedural game would be particularly interesting for them.
And that's fair.
Or you could play Among Us.
Or you could play Among Us, which we have determined is a mystery game.
Yeah.
Clearly, my boyfriend was skeptical of this when I told him that. He was like, I don't know.
I would say, like, Werewolf is like a mystery party game. You know, that's essentially what Among Us is.
I guess it's true. I don't know.
Think about that. Like, you're assembling evidence, you know?
Yeah. Among Us is the most procedurally generated of the you are the procedure.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. I didn't think about that. Well, there have been some. So we've been talking mostly about like detective games so far. But I think there are a couple of sort of like in the mystery genre games notable that we've not talked about that are less clearly detective games. I guess you are like an insurance inspector in Oberdin. I think.
Same thing.
So
exactly,
you're kind of a detective in a lame way.
Yeah. Really unsexy detective.
Yeah. Like probably have scurvy detective. Yeah. But in return, if you haven't listened to us, I played this. My boyfriend and I played this. I think it was here, so it must have been within the last 2 years. We've talked about it on the podcast before. You're reconstructing basically how like 60-ish people on a ship died. And the way you're doing that is you can go to kind of specific moments when someone died and see what's going on. And you've got to figure out sort of who each person is and how they died, and like fill it into your log. And the game does validate for you like every 3 that you get right. It locks it in. So it's theoretically possible to kind of brute force through some of this. As this like article that you posted did, what is the person doing? What? Don't play the game that way, buddy. Like, it's not Guess Who. Like you can brute force your way through some of it, or you can be like, oh, I'm sure it's this person or this person. Let's test both. Like, of course you can do that. But I do think some of these open-ended games, like there has to be a certain degree of trust that the player wants to engage with the game as it is intended, because at some point, yes, it is possible to just guess your way through any of these games.
Yeah.
My biggest Oberdin critique, as I'm sure you can go back and hear in more detail at the time I was playing it, is there are just a couple of them that are not as clever as the rest. And that's a bummer. It's a bummer when it's like, 95% of this mystery was really clever, and then there were like 5% of it that was dumb.
I did think it was really interesting, Lucas Pope talking about like designing it, that his original prototype was like, there's like 4 guys where you figure it out.
Yeah.
And he was like, yeah, I'll just scale it to 80 guys on a ship. That's fine. And quickly figured out, like, no, actually, I can't do 80 or 60.
Well, this also, though, I think is a great example of a game where, to some extent, it seems like it should be really easy, right? Like, you just have to write the events of a ship over, like, 2 days or whatever, including a sea monster. And, like, that's it. Like, that's the mystery, right? But that is a game in particular where I feel like you have to be so careful about, which portions of it are we seeing? Like, is this narrative that I've crafted something that you can pick up from just seeing, like, tiny little snapshot, like, frozen in time snapshots of these things at certain points? Like, do I give enough clues, but not too many clues? Do I give enough clues that make the player feel like so smart, and not as many clues that are just like lightest of light spoilers? Their name is on their bunk. Those are the ones I hated. I hated those. Those are so stupid. Like, somebody else could be in, just because the guy's in that bunk doesn't mean it's that guy. It could be somebody else.
He's stealing his bunk.
Yeah, you don't know.
There should have been one of those thrown in there.
Yeah, that would have been sick. That's all I want. There was just a few too many of those where it was like, I didn't feel clever solving this. I just felt stupid that I hadn't seen it earlier, that I was looking for something cleverer, and instead it was like, there's that guy asleep in his bunk. But like it just seems like deceptively simple to put something like that together, but to actually give the player what they need to be able to figure out that much information from like this very specific way of viewing what's going on is crazy to think about.
Mm-hmm.
And in a similar vein, like I feel like her story is also like, how do you craft this in a way where the player can find what they need to find here?
Yeah, all of Sam Barlow's games, who's the creator of Her Story, follow like the same basic premise of there's a lot of live action videos that you're scrubbing through and searching through in one way or another. Her Story is probably like the most traditional, like you're looking for like the culprit of a crime, of some sort, where you're going through one woman's sort of interview tapes with the police. And you can enter keywords that are discussed, and like when you open it up, the initial one is like murder to sort of get you started on what you're supposed to be doing. But from that, you're basically just, going through a person's video files, or you are playing as someone theoretically. There's like all of them have like the spooky element of they impose like you can see a person's shadow on the screen that isn't yours. There was one, the anecdote in the article I was reading was like when they're like playtesting it or playing a demo, is like one tester saw that and like jumped out of their chair and was like, man, I'm not into ghosts, okay? Which I thought was very funny. But most of it is, you essentially just have lots and lots of video footage and you can search through it. And even when you figure out the whodunit, you might not have actually pieced together the whole chain of events, right? So even when you have your answer, you may still be doing more investigating out of your desire to understand the full picture as well.
Right. Which does loop back around to one last piece of detective and mystery story crafting, which is making that accusation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is something that, again, I feel like in games is really, really tricky to handle, because you want to make sure that it has enough weight, right? Yeah. You don't want it to be like, I can just run around accusing anybody until I get the right person and it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But you also want to strike the balance of making the player prove that they have actually engaged with the mystery while not like giving them a 50 question multiple choice test. So it's when we come around to the end of those stories where it's something like, okay, maybe just I've figured out who it is, but I want to have the whole picture behind it, or I need to have the actual evidence supporting it. Mystery games just seem hard, dude. All games, every episode we talk about a genre is just me being like, that seems hard.
I mean, I feel like especially, these more open-ended ones are sort of about, the process of solving mysteries. And as long as that feels good, sometimes like the, emotional impact of a story is secondary, right? Or maybe not as needed as well. But when you're writing a linear one, you both have to balance like, okay, so the player needs to be feeling like they're figuring this out at a good pace. They need to feel like they're engaged in the mystery. And maybe also they need to feel like a big emotional impact when, they make a discovery. So it's an interesting balance of, wanting it to be a mystery game versus like wanting to have good storytelling as well. Like, I opened this by complaining that I felt like a lot of Raincode's mysteries were way too easy to figure out. But like, going back to Kodaka's other work, like I think one of my favorite cases in Danganronpa is one that's very easy. You can figure it out from before you go in there. It's just very emotionally like devastating. Like you can figure out who it is, but not like why it would possibly be that way, right? Which doesn't make it a very good mystery, but is effective storytelling at the same time.
It's all a spectrum. It's all a balance.
Yeah.
The real question is how much Sudoku your mystery game should have.
So much.
Probably maximum amounts. You might consider just making a Sudoku game.
Really, just more mini games. Snowboard through your mind palace, you know? That's what I want to do in a mystery game.
When are they going to be done with Fall Guys and make Murder by Numbers 2 for me?
Where you play as a Fall Guy?
Isn't Fall Guys dead? Isn't it a dead game?
I think it would be fun if, you know, this is sort of what Raincoat is, but it should be more like Fall Guys. You know? Like you're going through like a little obstacle course in Raincoat as you solve the mystery, but I feel like it should be like you're a little bean and you're like falling all over the place.
That's true. You know, one thing the mystery genre is missing is, you know, we talked a lot today about like, here are ways that it could feel more like you're actually a detective, right? Yeah. Like it could be more open, like it could be less like button prompty, it could be whatever. But you're right. More games should go in the opposite direction and be like, oh yeah, you're a detective. But like the way you're figuring this out is like, yeah, you have to do the slime mountain.
Yeah. It's metaphorical.
Exactly. And Murder by Numbers is a great example of that. I do have to do Picross in my head before I process any new information.
True. This is very true.
So, more games for people with Picross brains like mine.
Absolutely.
Well, Emma, as we come to the conclusion of our big mystery of what is a mystery game, what makes a good mystery game, etc., etc., do we miss any evidence? Anything else you want to include in our closing statements here?
No, I think we did a good overall impression of it.
Well, case closed.
Yep. Shut that notebook.
Well, listeners, do you take issue with our definition of a mystery game? Do you think there should be more puzzles in there? Are you like Clickbait Boyfriend, thinking, and I quote, "Isn't every game a mystery game if you really think about it?" Have you played great mystery games that we didn't talk about on this show? We didn't talk about Professor Layton at all.
Is Professor Layton a mystery game?
Isn't it? I don't know anything about Professor Layton. Oh, no, I've played Professor Layton. Sorry, I'm thinking of, what am I thinking of? Detective Conan. We didn't talk about Detective Conan.
That's not a video game.
Aren't there Detective Conan video games?
I guess probably, but it's not primarily a video game.
Professor Layton is sort of a mystery game.
Don't you mostly just solve, like, math problems, though?
Yeah, it's a lot of, brain teasers. But the brain teasers are in service of, like, people won't tell you. It's a mystery game if you were in a world where people wouldn't share any information with you without
unless you did
solving
math.
A brain teaser for them.
Okay.
So in that sense it is. But you're right, that it is based on puzzles. It's a slightly different type of puzzle than it often is. But you're right. You're right. Yeah. We didn't talk about old Layton. But if you have thoughts on mystery games or a mystery you would like us to solve, I guess, hit us up on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, check out the games in the hat, and read our blog featuring long-running series, Clickbait Boyfriend, and Split Screen. But most importantly, if you want to solve the mystery of what you should be doing every Sunday at noon, you should subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Casts, wherever you can find podcasts. There's no mystery about where you can find and subscribe to Talk This. Next week, we're talking about two games that I hadn't really heard of, I think.
Yes. Well, we're talking about The Silver Case for our old game and Honkai Star Rail. for a
Okay,
new
I've
game.
heard of Honkai Star Rail. The Silver
was
Case
gonna
sounds
say.
like it should be a mystery game.
It is sort of. It's more of a visual novel, I guess.
Do you consider
It's in the mystery genre, but is it a mystery game? You know?
We'll find out next week. And in 2 weeks, we'll be talking about the games that we've been playing for the past 6 weeks.
Absolutely.
Will Civilization make an appearance?
Yes.
I don't know. We have to sleep on the first. Well, we did sleep on the first flight because I am in Spain.
Yeah, she's recording this from Spain. Not at noon on Sunday, my time.
You're right. It's
not noon on Sunday
6 p.m. Closer to 7 p.m. now, I guess. But yeah, probably Civ. So if you're ready for me to once again be like, Civ 5, dangerous game, tune in for that. And for River City Girls 2, which I have no doubt finished. I'm sure I have managed to finish in time. I'm sure I didn't waste enough time.
They brought it to Spain.
Yeah. Well, that's it for this week's show. Emma, do you have a great way to kind of close the mystery, pull together all the loose ends?
This week, I hope that nobody comes and accuses you of, crimes.